With his last coin, he bought a ruined ranch that everyone considered a curse, not knowing he was about to unleash an untamable legend worth more than the entire town that despised him. If stories about the power of resilience resonate with you, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey together. The dry sound of a rifle being cocked echoed through the Canyon of Souls, a profane noise in the sacred stillness of the afternoon. Pressed against the reddish face of a monumental rock, Nahko barely breathed. His body, lean and hard like the stone itself, was a human shield for the magnificent creature trembling behind him, sweat shining on its obsidian black coat. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and ozone, a prelude to a storm brewing on the horizon. But the real storm was here, in the eyes of the men hunting him. Nahko could feel their gazes, hungry and cruel, sweeping the landscape for the slightest movement. His hand rested on the Mustang's neck, a gesture not of dominance but of communion, a silent promise that he would not abandon it to its fate. The horse, whom he called Shadow, neighed low, a guttural sound of contained fury, and stomped its hoof on the stony ground. There was fire in that animal, an indomitable spirit that refused to be broken, and it was this same fire that Nahko felt rekindling within himself. To the men hunting him, led by the merciless Colonel Vargas, he was just an Indian, forgotten by time, the last of his line, a ghost. Haunting a cursed land, little did they know they were facing a man who, having lost everything, had found in the heart of that beast the one thing worth fighting for until his last breath. A bullet struck the rock inches from his face, sending splinters that scratched his skin. Death was near, but for the first time in years, Nahko did not wish for it. The sky answered before the men could. A colossal thunderclap tore through the air, and the first drop of rain, cold and heavy, hit Nahko's forehead like a premonition. It was the signal. With a low whistle, a sound that was more a vibration in his chest than a note, he launched himself onto Shadow's back. There was no saddle, no reins, only the tangled mane between his fingers and the mutual trust forged in fire and solitude. They exploded from behind the rock like a force of nature, a black arrow fired into the growing gloom. The rifles spat fire in vain, their bullets lost in the dust and the rain that now fell in torrents as horse and rider plunged deeper into the stone labyrinth, the storm their only and powerful ally. Hours later, nestled in a rocky alcove that the rain had turned into a waterfall, the only sound was that of the storm and the Mustang's heavy breathing. Nahko ran his hand over the animal's trembling flank, calming it, feeling the vital warmth that emanated from it. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. Weeks ago, he had entered the town of redemption, a broken man, with nothing but the name of his ancestors and a single silver coin polished by hopelessness. He had traded it for the deed to the Devil's Ranch, a piece of barren, cursed land that everyone mocked, a tomb where he went to await the end. It was supposed to be his final act of surrender, a silent farewell to a world that had never wanted him. He expected to find nothing but ghosts and dust when he passed through the ranch's rotten gates. And that's exactly what he found. The main house was a skeleton of beams. Exposed to the merciless sun, the corral a web of fallen fences, and the well, a dark hole that exhaled the smell of death and stagnation. The wind whistled through the broken windows, singing a funeral dirge for the hopes that had died there. It was the perfect setting for the end of a lineage, a place as broken and forgotten as he himself felt. He walked through the desolate property, not as a new owner, but as a grave digger, measuring the ground for his own grave. It was then that he heard it. A low sound, the scrape of a hoof on rotten wood, followed by an impatient snort that cut through the deadly silence. It came from the barn, a structure that looked as if it had been crushed by a giant's hand, its roof caved in and its walls leaning at impossible angles. With his heart beating a forgotten rhythm of curiosity, Nahko cleared a path through the rubble. And then he saw him. In a miraculously intact stall, surrounded by broken beams, was the horse. It was no ordinary animal. It was a creature of the night, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb the little light that filtered into the place. Trapped, but not defeated, the Mustang stared back at him, its eyes burning with a wild fury and an ancient intelligence. In that instant, Nahko saw not an animal, but a reflection of his own imprisoned soul, and he knew that his coin had not bought a grave, but a resurrection. The approach was slow, a wordless dialogue between two wild souls. The Mustang reared, its nostrils flared, a clear warning for Nahko not to come closer. But Nahko saw no threat, only pain and a defiance that mirrored his own. He stopped at a safe distance and simply stood there, speaking in a low voice in the language of his ancestors, not words of command, but of recognition. He spoke of the land, of the wind, and of the freedom that had been stolen from them both. For hours he remained motionless as the horse studied him, the panic in its eyes giving way to a cautious curiosity. That day, Nahko did not try to free him. He simply showed that he was no longer a cage, but a companion in captivity. The days that followed were a ritual of patience and hard work. Nahko cleared the debris from the barn door with his bare hands, his muscles screaming in protest. He found a small stream of clean water hidden among the rocks and carried buckets for the horse, even before quenching his own thirst. It was from the few reclusive dwellers of the hills that he learned the truth. The devil of the ranch was not a curse, but that indomitable spirit which had resisted all attempts at capture by Colonel Vargas, the former owner, destroying everything in its fury. When the passage was finally clear, the Mustang did not flee. Instead, it took a step out, into the sunlight, and rested its muzzle on Nahko's chest. In that touch, the pact was sealed. The man had freed the legend, and the legend had given the man a reason to live. This trust, built in silence and respect, is the foundation of the most powerful alliances. If this demonstration of loyalty touched you, show your support for Nahko and Shadow in the comments, and subscribe to find out what fate has in store for this unlikely duo. The dawn that followed the storm painted the sky in purple and gold, washing the world and revealing a clarity Nahko hadn't felt in years. The air was cold and clean, laden with the scent of wet earth and sage. He watched Shadow drink from a puddle formed by the rain. The animal's body relaxed, yet alert. The desperate escape of the previous night had changed everything. Nahko understood that Colonel Vargas would not give up. The man's obsession was not with the horse's value, but with what it represented, the indomitable spirit of that land, something Vargas's money could fence in but never possess. Nahko, by forming a bond with Shadow, had not just tamed a beast, he had become the guardian of a force the Colonel was determined to crush. They couldn't keep running. Running was a slow, death, a concession to fear. Nahko looked to the east, towards the ranch that should have been his grave, and in his mind a new strategy formed, audacious and dangerous. They would go back. They would return to the heart of the danger, to the place that everyone, including Vargas, considered useless and cursed. The Devil's Ranch would no longer be a haven for ghosts, but a fortress. With the knowledge his ancestors passed down to him about the land, about how to use every rock, every canyon, and every whisper of the wind as a weapon, Nahko would turn the perceived weakness of his property into its greatest defense. He and Shadow were no longer prey. They were becoming the very specter that haunted these lands. The journey back was a lesson in stealth. They didn't ride, they moved like the wind, slipping through canyons and following dry riverbeds that only the natives knew. Every step Shadow took was deliberate, silent, as if the horse understood that sound was an enemy. Nahko, in me, turn, no longer saw a desolate landscape, but a map of possibilities. His eyes scanned every rock formation, every dense thicket, not with the desperation of a fugitive, but with the precision of a predator studying his territory. He saw where an avalanche could be triggered with a single shout, where false trails could lead Vargas's men to dead ends, and where the natural acoustics of the rocks could turn a single horse's neigh into the ghostly echo of an entire herd. When they arrived at the Devil's Ranch, under the cover of night, the place looked the same, but Nahko's perception had changed forever. Those ruins were no longer a monument to failure, but a labyrinth that only he knew. In the days that followed, he worked with a silent fury. He didn't build walls, but dug subtle traps, covering them with fragile branches. He loosened the remaining beams of the barn, creating a deadly trigger that could be sprung from a distance. The cursed, dry well became the center of his strategy, a dark abyss disguised as a simple hole. All the while, Shadow was his watchman, posted on a nearby ridge, its black silhouette against the sky, a silent warning that the guardian and the legend of that land were finally ready for war. The wait was not long. A dust cloud on the horizon, growing like a bad omen, announced the arrival of Colonel Vargas and his men. From a high vantage point, hidden by a rock ledge, Nahko watched the scene. Shadow stood beside him, still as a statue of ebony. Only the occasional twitch of its skin betraying the energy contained within its body. There were a dozen men riding carelessly, their laughter and harsh conversations echoing through the valley, profaning the silence. The colonel led the group, his face a map of arrogance and contempt as he looked at the ruins. To him, this was the end of the line, a trap the prey itself had chosen. He didn't see a fortress. He saw a tomb. Vargas made a dismissive gesture, and 4 of his men dismounted, advancing, on foot towards the ruined house, their weapons drawn. "Find the savage and his horse," the colonel shouted, his voice filled with a victorious boredom. The men spread out, kicking debris, mocking the misery of the place. It was then that Nahko gave the first signal. He brought his fingers to his mouth and emitted a sharp sound, the cry of a red-tailed hawk. The sound ricocheted off the canyon walls, distorted and amplified, sounding like a ghostly wail. Simultaneously, Shadow raised its head and let out a powerful neigh, which the echo transformed into the sound of an entire herd, coming from all directions. The men stopped, disoriented, fear beginning to eat away at their confidence. The ranch was no longer silent. It had found a voice. "Idiots! It's the wind!" Vargas bellowed from his horse, his patience wearing thin. "Keep going! I don't want the horse spooked by your whining." Pushed by the colonel's fury, the men advanced again, even more nervous. One of them, trying to prove his courage, took a wide step to get around a pile of rotten planks. The ground beneath his feet simply vanished. A sharp scream was swallowed by the earth as he plunged into the darkness of the well Nahko had camouflaged. The hollow thud of the body hitting the bottom was the first real note in the symphony of fear Nahko was composing. The others recoiled instinctively, their weapons now aimed not at a visible enemy, but at the treacherous ground itself. Panic was a contagious disease, and Vargas's arrogance turned to pure rage. "Get him out of there, you useless fools!" As 2 men ran clumsily towards the edge of the well, Nahko acted again. A small stone, thrown with the deadly accuracy of a slingshot, struck the main support beam of what was left of the barn, exactly at the point he had weakened. There was a guttural groan of old wood protesting, followed by a deafening roar as the entire structure collapsed inward, burying the 2 men under an avalanche of beams and shingles. The dust rose, suffocating, mixing with the screams of pain. In less than a minute, without firing a single shot, Nahko had incapacitated 3 of Vargas's men. The hunt had turned into a silent massacre, orchestrated not by a man, but by the cursed ranch itself. Colonel Vargas's fury exploded like a powder keg. His revolver leaped from its holster, and he fired 6 times into the shadows of the ruins, the shots echoing like profane hammer blows in the ensuing silence. It was an act of blind fury that only served to further terrify his own men. They now saw the curse in every broken beam, heard death in the whistle of the wind. "Enough games," he snarled, dismounting with a sharp movement. The arrogance on his face had twisted into a mask of hatred. "Spread out. I want that Indian's head and that horse's hide, now." He unsheathed a machete himself, slicing the air, a leader who now led by fear, not respect. The order, given at gunpoint, left the men no choice. They moved like men, walking to the gallows, their eyes wide, every snap of a twig sounding like a gunshot. That's when Nahko gave Shadow the signal. The Mustang moved, not in panic, but with a deliberate fluidity, a dark silhouette passing through a gap in the ruins for a single tempting second. Two of the henchmen saw the movement. The prize, the reason they were there, was real and within reach. "There he is!" one of them shouted, and caution was replaced by greed. They ran towards the narrow passage, a treacherous shortcut between two unstable walls of an old storeroom. It was exactly where Nahko wanted them. With a firm tug on a vine that stretched to his hiding place, he released the key to his next trap, a cascade of rocks and loose earth, carefully balanced atop the passage. The roar was deafening, and the exit was sealed, trapping the two men in a tomb of dust and panic, separating them from the rest of the group. Vargas's remaining men were paralyzed, a circle of fear closing in around them. The muffled cries of their trapped comrades echoed from the rocks, a constant reminder of their own vulnerability. The ranch was no longer a place, but a living, hungry entity. The wind seemed to whisper threats, and every dancing shadow looked like the silhouette of Nahko or his demonic horse. Vargas saw hesitation turn to insubordination in his men's eyes. "Move, you cowards, or I'll bury you here myself," he screamed. But his words were empty, swallowed by the terror Nahko had sown. The Colonel realized, with a wave of icy fury, that he was alone. His men were just spectators at their own announced funeral. With a snarl of contempt for his own men, Vargas turned, his machete held firmly, and marched towards the skeleton of the main house, the epicenter of the chaos. He was an experienced hunter, and his anger sharpened his instincts rather than completely blinding them. He moved with a predatory economy of motion, his eyes scanning every corner, every broken beam. And then he stopped, standing in the archway of a destroyed door, silhouetted against the dusty light of the interior, was Nahko. He was not the spectre the men feared, but a man of flesh and blood, his face painted with dust and defiance. At his side, Shadow snorted, steam rising from its nostrils like smoke, not an animal but a guardian. The hunt was over. The personal war between the two men was about to begin. "So the cockroach comes out of its hole," Vargas sneered, a cruel smile that didn't reach his steel-cold eyes. "I've come to take what's mine, Indian, the horse, the land, and now your life as a bonus." He took a step forward, the machete swinging slowly by his side, a deadly pendulum. Nahko remained motionless, his calm an affront to the Colonel's seething fury. "You cannot own the wind, Colonel," Nahko said, his voice low but resonating with the power of the very stone around him. "Nor the fire that burns in this animal, and this land recognizes no owners, only guardians." The response infuriated Vargas. With a guttural cry, he didn't attack Nahko directly, but kicked what was left of a heavy oak table, sending it hurtling towards them. The move was brutal and swift, designed to separate horse and man. Shadow reared, neighing in defiance, its hooves striking the rotten wood with the force of hammers. In the same instant, Nahko rolled to the side, his hand finding the handle of an old fireplace shovel among the debris. When he rose, the two men faced each other over the makeshift barrier, Vargas's machete against Nahko's rusted iron. The air filled with dust and hatred, and the first spark of metal on metal lit the gloom as the Colonel struck the first blow. The sound of metal echoed through the ruined house. A song of death played with blind fury by Vargas and desperate precision by Nahko. Each swing of the machete was an attempt to reap, each block with the shovel a cry of resistance. Nahko was more agile, using the debris to his advantage, forcing the colonel to misstep on loose floorboards. But Vargas was stronger, and his rage gave him a bestial vigor. With a brutal move, he hooked the tip of the machete on the shovel and tore it from Nahko's hands, sending it flying. For a moment, Nahko was defenseless. Vargas's smile was that of a predator cornering its prey, but Vargas wasn't fighting one man. He was fighting the spirit of the ranch. At the exact moment the colonel raised the machete for the final blow, Shadow reared up behind him, not to attack, but to slam its front hooves with full force onto the rotten floor. The wood, punished by decades of neglect, cracked and splintered with a sound like thunder. The floor gave way under the colonel's weight, who fell to his knees as one of his legs crashed through the broken planks, trapping him up to his thigh. The death blow went wide, the machete's blade embedding itself harmlessly in the floor beside him. The shock and pain gave Nahko the time he needed. He didn't grab the shovel. Instead, he seized a piece of a broken beam, heavy and splintered, and advanced. With a cry that was the voice of his ancestors and of that wounded land, he aimed not for Vargas's head, but for his shoulder. The impact was dull and heavy. The colonel roared in pain as the bone shattered, and his body slumped to the side, defeated not by a weapon, but by the very skeleton of the house he had tried to steal. Vargas's remaining men, who witnessed their leader's fall, saw not a man, but a spirit of vengeance rise from the rubble. The fear, which was once a seed, blossomed into full-blown panic. They looked at the colonel, groaning in pain and helplessness, trapped in the floor itself, and then at Nahko, standing over him, the bloodied beam in his hand, a primordial figure. Beside him, Shadow snorted, the sound echoing like a final judgment. There was no order to retreat. It was an instinctive rout. They ran, freeing their trapped companions from the sealed passage, dragging the injured man. From the well, their movements desperate and chaotic. The greed that had brought them there had been purged by pure terror. With difficulty, they hoisted Colonel Vargas's broken body onto a horse's back, his arrogance replaced by a feverish silence of pain and humiliation. Nahko watched them leave, a shameful retreat of men who came to conquer and left like frightened thieves. He made no move to stop them. The dust they kicked up as they fled settled slowly, and silence returned to the Devil's ranch. But it was a new silence, no longer heavy with desolation, but vibrant with sovereignty. Nahko let the beam fall. He walked to Shadow and pressed his forehead against the horse's strong neck, feeling the pulse of the untamable life that now beat in unison with his own. They had not just survived, they had been reborn from the ashes of that cursed place, transforming it into their sanctuary. As the setting sun bathed the canyon in hues of blood and amber, Nahko didn't feel the exhaustion that weighed on his bones. He walked slowly through his fortress of ruins, not to assess the damage, but to honor the scars. The broken beam, the open well, the collapsed barn. They were no longer symbols of decay, but monuments to his first victory. Shadow followed him closely, the sound of its hooves on the packed earth, the only rhythm in that reverent silence. The horse rested its muzzle on Nahko's shoulder, a gesture of complicity that said everything. The land had answered his call, and together they had defended it. For the first time, this place wasn't a refuge or a grave, it was a home. The news reached the town of Redemption not as a report, but as a tremor. Vargas's men returned in tatters, not with the pride of conquerors, but with the haunted eyes of those who have seen a ghost. They babbled stories in the saloon about a living land that fought back, about the ground swallowing men whole, and about a black horse whose neighs sounded like an army. They spoke not of a cunning Indian, but of a spirit that commanded the wind and the stones. The legend of the Devil's Ranch was rewritten that night. The name, once a joke about a cursed place, was now whispered with genuine fear. And Nahko, the man everyone had despised, became something more, the ghost of the canyon, the indomitable guardian who had bought a kingdom with a single silver coin. In the days that followed, Nahko did not rest. Victory was not an end, but a beginning. With a determination forged in fire, he began to rebuild. Using lumber salvaged from the collapsed barn and making adobe with the red earth beneath his feet, he began to raise not the walls of a fortress, but those of a home. He cleaned the well, finding an underground spring that ran clean and cold. He worked under the relentless sun, his muscles protesting, but his soul singing. Shadow was always nearby, not as a pet, but as a silent partner in the endeavor, its presence a constant source of strength. Every beam he raised was an act of defiance. Every stone he set a declaration. This land had a guardian, and he was not going anywhere. Meanwhile, miles away in his opulent hacienda, Colonel Vargas stewed in his humiliation. With his arm in a sling and his leg bandaged, the physical pain was a constant reminder of the defeat, but nothing burned as much as the blow to his pride. In his mind, he hadn't been defeated by one man's cunning, but by the witchcraft of a savage and his four-legged demon. The obsession with the horse had morphed into a pure, cold hatred for Nahko. He would look out the window at his vast lands, but all he could see was the tiny, defiant stain of the Devil's Ranch. He would not send more men to be swallowed by the earth. He realized that to kill a ghost, you don't use bullets, you use fire. The weeks turned into a month, and the Devil's Ranch began to breathe again. The sound that now echoed through the valley was not the wind in ruins, but a hammer striking a steady rhythm. Nahko had built a small corral with salvaged wood, strong and secure. Next to what was left of the house, a small garden stubbornly sprouted from the red earth, irrigated by the clean water from the well. He wasn't just rebuilding a place, he was restoring a soul. His body, once a bundle of bones and despair, was now taut with muscle and purpose. And Shadow, free to run, never strayed far. Its black coat, a point of living power against the landscape that was slowly beginning to flourish again under its guardian's care. While life took root at the ranch, the seed of Vargas's revenge rotted in fertile soil. The dry season had arrived, turning the golden grass of the canyon into a giant fuse. The colonel, studying wind maps in his dark office, found the weapon he was looking for. He didn't need brave men to face a ghost, he needed cowards with torches. He summoned 2 outlaws, men whose souls were as arid as the land they walked on, promising them gold in exchange for ashes. The plan was cruel in its simplicity. Wait for a night with a strong east wind and set fires at multiple points at the entrance to the Canyon of Souls. They weren't going to hunt Nahko. They were going to incinerate his world, turning his fortress into a furnace and the wind itself, his former ally, into his executioner. The first warning came not to the eyes, but to the nose. On a moonless night, the wind shifted. It was no longer the cool mountain breeze, but a hot, dry breath from the east, carrying a scent that was a profanity, the acrid smell of sage and dry grass burning en masse. Shadow sensed it first. It neighed in the corral, a sharp sound of alarm, stamping its hooves against the earth. Nahko emerged from his makeshift shelter and knew, even before he saw. Climbing the rock that served as his sentinel, he looked towards the mouth of the canyon, and his blood ran cold. This was no accidental fire. It was a wall of fire, a line of orange flames stretching from one canyon wall to the other, pushed by the wind directly towards them. Vargas no longer wanted to capture him. He wanted to erase him from existence. Panic was a hot wave that threatened to drown him, but the discipline of a lifetime of survival pushed it back down. The roar of the approaching fire was already a distant murmur, growing with every second. The air was growing heavy, the smell of smoke turning into a metallic taste at the back of his throat. Fleeing out of the canyon was impossible. They were trapped. But as the fire devoured the land he loved, the land itself offered him an answer, an ancestral memory, a deep knowledge of the geography of that place. There was a spot, several miles deeper into the canyon, where the creek bed narrowed and the granite walls rose almost vertically, bare of any vegetation, a stone scar. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was their only chance. Without hesitation, he ran to the corral, the heat already kissing his back, and threw open the gate for Shadow. There was no time for words, only for the trust that bound them, as they plunged deeper into the heart of their fortress, running not from the fire, but towards their only salvation. The ride was an escape from hell itself. Horse and rider became a single entity. A black arrow shot through a world coming undone in flames. The roar of the fire grew into a hungry monster, devouring the canyon behind them, its hot breath a whip on Nahko's back. Sparks and embers rained from the sky, turning the night into an apocalyptic twilight, and the thick smoke burned his lungs with every desperate breath. Small desert animals, rabbits, coyotes, snakes, ran alongside them, a terrified tide of life united in the primordial instinct to escape. Nahko clung to Shadow's mane, whispering words of encouragement that were lost in the chaos, trusting the animal's instincts as it ran not with panic, but with focused power, its hooves hammering out a rhythm of life against the death that pursued them. And then he saw it. Ahead, the landscape transformed. The scrubland disappeared, giving way to a narrow gorge where the granite walls rose, smooth and bare, like the exposed ribs of the earth. It was the stone scar from his memories. With one last push, they burst into that sterile refuge. Shadow stopped abruptly, its body trembling, its flanks heaving in clouds of steam. Nahko slid from its back, his legs giving way under the weight of adrenaline and exhaustion. They barely had time to breathe before hell arrived. At their door, a wave of superheated air hit them, and the wall of fire roared past the two entrances of the gorge, a river of flame licking the edges of their stone island. The sound was absolute, deafening. Trapped but alive, Nahko and Shadow watched, helpless, as the world they had begun to rebuild was consumed by Colonel Vargas's incandescent hatred. The heat was so intense that the granite itself seemed to sweat. The air, thick and suffocating, burned Nahko's lungs with every stolen breath. Black ashes, the ghosts of everything that had been alive, rained down on them like an unholy snow, covering Shadow's coat and Nahko's hair with the grief of the land. Through the curtain of smoke and orange glow, he saw the silhouettes of his meager constructions being devoured, every beam he had raised becoming a funeral pyre for his hopes. It was an attack not just on his life, but on his soul. Vargas didn't want to kill him. He wanted to erase him, to reduce to ashes the proof that a broken man could rise again. Nahko leaned against the cool rock wall, feeling Shadow's tremor beside him and a despair deeper than any he had ever felt washed over him. The ranch had not been his grave, but perhaps the fire would be. The hours dragged on like an agony. When the roar of the fire finally faded to a distant murmur, the ensuing darkness was almost total, broken only by embers that glowed like the eyes of 1,000 demons in the devastated landscape. The dawn revealed an unrecognizable world. Everything was black. The ground, the twisted trees, the distant hills, a monotone of annihilation. Nahko's work, his sweat and his rebirth had become a carpet of charcoal. He stepped out of the stone gorge and the smell of death and smoke hit him like a punch. But then something made him stop. Shadow, instead of cowering from the devastation, took a step forward and stamped its hoof on the charred ground. The sound was dull, defiant, and Nahko understood. Vargas had burned the grass, the wood, the surface life, but he could not burn the earth, he could not burn the rock, and he could not burn the spirit that dwelled within them. The fire had not destroyed them. It had stripped the battlefield bare, leaving only the essential: the stone, the man, and the legend. The path back was a pilgrimage through a cemetery. Beneath Shadow's hooves, the ash rose in silent clouds, covering them in the dust of all they had lost. Each step was an effort, not against the distance, but against the weight of desolation. When they finally reached the ruins of their ranch, what they saw was a charred skeleton. The adobe walls he had raised had crumbled. The wooden beams were now just lines of charcoal on the ground. It was total annihilation. But amidst the devastation, one thing remained. The circle of stones Nahko had used to reinforce the mouth of the well was intact. An eye of stone staring at the smoky sky. With his heart in his throat, he approached, grabbed the scorched bucket, and lowered it into the darkness. The sound that followed was not a rope hitting dry earth, but a soft, clear splash. He hoisted the bucket, and the water that came up was cold, clear, reflecting the grey sky like a mirror of hope. Life, deep within the earth, had not burned. That same morning, Colonel Vargas stood on his veranda, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching the distant column of smoke that stained the horizon. To him, it was a monument to his own cruelty, the final period on an irritating story. He had eradicated not just the man, but the very land that had given him refuge. He toasted to the silence, to absolute victory. What he didn't know was that, at that very moment, Nahko was drinking from the water of his well, not to quench his thirst, but to seal a new oath. The fire had not taken everything from him. It had given him a new weapon. In that world of ash and coal, he and Shadow, the Mustang as black as night, were now invisible. Vargas hadn't created a grave. He had created the perfect hunting ground for a ghost, and the hunt would no longer be for the horse. It would be for the Colonel's soul. From the ashes of cruelty, a new kind of justice is born, silent and relentless. If you are ready to see the ghost hunt its creator, subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of this saga. Thank you for joining us on this journey.